the session this afternoon so that it's interesting, challenging, provocative. We have a subject that's been actually discussed implicitly, if not explicitly until now, which is old and new challenges. Basically, the importance of history and actuality in international relations in our area and worldwide. We've seen that history is a very important part of international relations in the Balkans, and we've heard it from the Serbian ambassador and later heard it from other speakers as well. Everything develops past dependent. Everything develops in a historical time. So what happened before has an impact on what's happening now and what will happen in the future. This seems to be like an impossible to escape trap. It seems like the trap of history. But what we know from the social sciences not only is that history is not really what happened. History is what we make of it. History is what we construct. History is very much politics, and history is very much perception at what has happened. So it might not be really such a trap, and it's a lot of work to do with the reconstruction, the understanding, the interpretation of what has happened in the past. We have the opportunity to have today two speakers that have a very long and very important experience in international relations. Two speakers that can teach us a lot about the recent history of Central and Eastern Europe and the recent history of the Balkans. It's a big honor for me to be here, and I cannot do other than repeat myself, because last year I had the opportunity to introduce Mr. Ambassador Čelak, like I do today, and what I said is that it's a legend sitting next to me. Well, now we have two legends of the recent history of diplomatic relations in Central and Eastern Europe, and our first guest is Ambassador Viktor Jakovic from the United States, who was ambassador in Bosnia and Herzegovina, in Slovenia, who has worked in Moldova, and is a very, very good expert, a very good source of information on the policy in these regions and on US policy on these regions. Mr. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the New Strategy Center for the invitation to be here with you. It's truly an honor to be here, and I think it's a very, very important event and one that will go down in history as part of Romania's contribution to a very important dialogue. It's especially poignant that we're doing this in Timișoara. It's been said before by other speakers, but the historic role that Timișoara has played in the region, and most recently in the events of 1989, are well known. Myself, I visited Timișoara. The last time was in 1983. And at that time, I talked with a lot of people, and I was impressed with how people were frankly struggling, it seemed, with daily existence. Now, in 2021, you are going to be the European cultural capital. And when I check the websites of the United States and Europe on Timișoara, I see you are designated as a prime tourist designation. And this is only a mark for me of the great progress that has been made by Romania and the great progress that has been made by Timișoara in the meantime. As a former United States ambassador in the region and elsewhere, my viewpoints are obviously shaped by my experiences. I was very fortunate, I feel, to have been one of the American officials who was tasked with managing or trying to manage fallout from the fall of socialism and communism in Eastern Europe, the falling apart of the Soviet Union, and the dissolution of Yugoslavia. My job at that time was very simple. I was to travel around in these regions at those times and to report back to Washington what I found. What were the people thinking? What were the governments thinking? What were their aspirations? and at the same time to help the emerging states and the emerging entities in as much as they had aspirations to join the Euro-Atlantic community of states. Romania was very much a part of that. This was a period of emergence of sovereign states, and Romania was very much a part of that. I feel very proud of the role I had, whatever small role I had, in dealing with the Romanian leaderships at that time, which may have helped in some way in the steps that they took to what they have eventually, which is membership in NATO and full membership in the European Union. I think the presidency of the EU Council coming up in 2019 is just another milestone, not only in Romanian history, but in European history on this developmental march that your country is making. Well, let me speak generally to some of the transformations that we are facing. Today in this community of nations, the Euro-Atlantic community of nations, we are confronted by myriad challenges and situations. We need to develop approaches that find functional solutions to the problems that we're confronted with. To name a few, if we go into a geographic look, I can point to the extraordinary rise of China, evolving relations with Russia by Europe and the United States, multiple power centers, India, excuse me, India, South America, South Asia, Africa, the America First doctrine, or the doctrine of principled realism, that is, as it is sometimes called on the part of my own government, the United States government. This is indeed a new challenge as well. And the European Union striving to consolidate itself at the same time that it needs to protect its interest and project its influence. Well, that's the geographic lineup. If we look at the thematic lineup, it's no less daunting. Threats to climate change. We had an entire session on the threats to an open cyberspace and security of the cyberspace. Blocks to free commerce and trade, nuclear proliferation, management of refugee flows, continuing corruption, terrorism, populism, nationalism. I'm disappointing myself here. Maybe I should stop with that list. I think today's leaderships, whether in Romania or elsewhere, need to understand that there is a historic background to all of this. I know that there is a tendency to be obsessed with finding immediate solutions to immediate crises, but we must understand that we cannot ignore the history behind some of these trends. We do so at our own risk. Let me turn first to China, where, according to the IMF, the size of the China's economy has overtaken that of the United States already in 2014. The size of the Chinese economy, the entire economic output, was $17.6 trillion. In 2014, the American economy, the total size of it was $17.4 trillion. China today has launched its Asian Investment Initiative, which seeks to supplant the Trans-Pacific Partnership that the United States has now withdrawn from. And they're putting a lot of investment into this. The GDP of China has skyrocketed over the last few decades. On the security side, China continues to harden offshore islands into full-fledged military installations. According to a recent edition of the Financial Times, China has this year overtaken the United States in sheer number of military naval craft. It is the biggest naval power in the world, bar none. In 1985, China had 3 submarines. So what is Asia going to look like in the future? Will the staunch American allies of the Philippines, Japan, and South Korea, will they remain firmly linked with the United States? Or will there be a new emerging power balance in Asia with China as the focal point? Believe it or not, I think the entire world will be looking to countries like Romania to provide some insight into this, because you are at a nexus point on the One Belt, One Road initiative from China going into Europe, and you are part of the 16+1 initiative, or at least a targeted part of the 16+1 initiative from China. These are things that we will look to Romania and other countries for some responses to. If I look to the issue of Russia and Europe, the emergence of Russian militarism has certainly dashed the hopes that people may have had in the West and in the United States that Russia might someday join us in a community of nations respecting democratic principles and a certain type of behavior in international affairs. Obviously, we underestimated a lot of factors in Russia, the need for, that they feel for a strong central leadership, the severe isolation, cultural and information isolation of the Russian people and government, the sense of grievance that they feel, the sense of suspicion that they feel towards Western objectives. And I don't mean to, by saying all that, to excuse Moscow's actions. The illegal annexation of Crimea, continued activity in East Ukraine, proxy wars in Syria and elsewhere, penetration of American and European institutions and processes. All of this clearly demonstrates that Russia is a very formidable adversary for the United States, for Romania, for the EU, and for NATO. The two enlargements of NATO and EU can actually become endangered in this new constellation of factors. We only have to look at the recent Macedonian referendum, which failed to couple the aspirations of the Macedonian people for EU and NATO membership together with a name change in agreement with Greece. We can talk more about that later. But in any case, we must remain strengthened and vigilant in being fully cognizant of the dangers of Russian militarism and adventurism. The expansion, the enlargement of NATO and EU are certainly great triumphs that we have all achieved in this part of the world. But even countries that are already in the EU and already in NATO, even that membership can become endangered as we see a more and more emboldened Moscow. The penetration or penetrability, I would call it, of East European allies is very troubling. And here again, we look to Romania to be a bulwark of Euro-Atlantic standards and principles in the region, in Southeast European region, in the Balkan region. Finally, I would address, there are many different regions we can talk about, but I need to address what's happening in the United States, in my own country, because we have a new administration. It's not so new anymore, a couple of years in office, the Trump administration, which has declared a doctrine of America first, or we hear the phrase principled realism. This has had significant impact on international economic relations and political relations. The question we all have, and the question we have in the United States, is this a temporary aberration, or is this the harbinger of a new era of American thinking? I think, frankly, it is, for my money, it is the latter. It is the harbinger of a new feeling in the United States. Don't forget that for most Americans, there was a feeling of frustration about the global engagements that the United States was involved in. And this, more than anything, resulted in the rise of Trump into the White House. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, the United States accounted for over 30%, almost 1/3 of the total global economic output. Today, it is less than 20%. So what we're looking at is very much a, you might call it a normalization of our relations. Challenges in the Balkans, those have been talked about quite a bit in the previous panels. I know that that is the title of this session of this conference, but I will hit upon that very lightly because we've had so many people speak about it already. Suffice to say that in my experience in the Balkans, I have been singularly impressed by the talent of the people, the determination of the people, the survivability, the resilience of the people to go through crisis after crisis and yet find a solution. Throughout history, there has usually been an overarching political and security architecture over the region. And I submit to you that these days, that architecture can be provided by the EU and by NATO. But what is needed now is a fast-track policy, not a pulling back from engagement. What is needed now on the part of the international community and the EU and NATO is a fast-track policy whereby the countries that aspire to join these associations can do so quickly, because the factors that I've just discussed that are not friendly to the enlargements of EU and NATO will step into the void if we do not act quickly. And there is no region beyond the Balkans that we need to enlarge to. Does anybody really think that a country in Central Asia or in the Middle East is going to be a full member of NATO or EU? The last frontier, if you will, for this enlargement is standing before us. It is the Balkans. It is Southeastern Europe. This needs to be done coupled with international guidance to many of these countries in terms of pluralism, democracy, respect for the voice of a variety of citizens, and also market economy. There's a need for the strengthening of regional associations. In spite of the fact that I'm an American, I'm the chairman of the Business Advisory Council for Southeastern Europe and Eurasia. And there is very much a need for this kind of organization. We have some 50 organizations that are cooperative in the region. We need even more, and we need to strengthen the ones that we have. I'm also a member of the board of the Vienna Economic Forum, which, by the way, is going to have a meeting next year in April in recognition of your presidency of the EU Council. And that is another, another organization that can be helpful to Romania, but also helpful to this idea of enlargement, rapid enlargement in the region. The multicultural nature of most Balkan states needs to be respected. This can only enhance democracy, enhance pluralism, tolerance, reconfiguring borders and frontiers to achieve mono-national entities can be very dangerous and could lead to problems, including nationalism, more nationalism, protectionism, and isolationism. If I can address for just a few seconds the Romanian upcoming EU Council presidency, it is truly a historic milestone. And there will be continuing challenges. You've already heard that under your presidency, officially, Brexit will take place. And a lot of other things will take place. There are budget deadlines and things of this nature. You don't need advice from an outsider about what to do. You have very capable Romanian diplomats, Romanian scholars, and Romanian experts to handle the coming Romanian presidency. But if I were to go down a quick checklist of what I would look to for a Romanian presidency, it would look something like this. The opportunity to develop a successful aftermath of Brexit, including follow-on agreements on financial and banking arrangements. Number two would be continuing forward progress in the Balkans, and here there are all sorts of issues that need to be handled. We heard this morning from Foreign Minister Dacic. We heard how painful and how difficult the process is in dealing with Serbia, Albania, Kosovo. But there will be other issues in Southeastern Europe that need to be handled by the Romanian presidency: Bosnia, Macedonia, Turkey, further demarcation of borders, the floundering, I have to admit, Dayton Accords in Bosnia-Herzegovina. There will be an opportunity to look at a post-Dayton approach to resolving the problems of Bosnia-Herzegovina. And not to mention, of course, as we already did, the post-referendum period in Macedonia. Number three could be energizing the EU's neighborhood policy. And I was pleased to hear this from Foreign Minister Melishkanu. Not to forget the neighboring countries to the EU, With all the problems within the EU, it is easy to forget that, but Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia, these are areas that desperately need linkage with the EU, and Romania, I think, has a pivotal position vis-a-vis those states. New initiatives on energy supply issues, especially as they concern Turkey, Russia, and Azerbaijan. There can be a contribution positively to the dialogue on controlled inflow of migration. So much has been said already about that. This is certainly a preoccupation of the current Austrian presidency of the European Council. Developing forward-looking policies on cybersecurity, and we had an entire session on cybersecurity. Given your talent and your proven talent in IT in Romania, I think there's a special opportunity here. Strengthening coordination between the EU and NATO. We've heard something about that, but I have always been impressed by the fact that EU headquarters and NATO headquarters are only miles apart in Brussels or near Brussels, and yet the coordination between the two has been very meager, except perhaps in the last few years. Facilitating the free flow of commerce, trade, and business with some of the organizations that I mentioned. And finally, extending outreach to China and other parts of the world in the interests of the EU and in the interests of Romania. This is going to be a great opportunity for Romania. I need to say just a few words about Romanian-United States relations. I personally regard Romania as one of the two fundamental pillars in Eastern Europe, together with Poland. I think these are the states that have the greatest regional influence. In this regard, we will be looking to Romania for influence in Ukraine, along with Poland. And you can have I think, a more assertive stance in providing guidance and assistance to Moldova. In the security sector, our relations are very deep. Our bilateral relations are very deep and very strong. We have more than 1,000 troops here. You have been acquiring significant capabilities from the United States and from NATO. The developments in the Black Sea are being watched very carefully. This is a key part of the NATO alliance, and it's very key, of course, for Romania's future as well. You are, in my opinion, in Romania, a valid interpreter of Russian motives and Russian interests in the region. You know, sometimes in the West, including in Washington, we need a sharper focus on this issue. And I think a sharper focus on what is happening from Russia can certainly come from Romania, not only based on current events, but based on your long historical experience. This is something that can come from Bucharest. At the same time, I recognize that you will be finding a balance between a United States that many people view as entrenching itself and not as engaged as before in the region, and a Europe that is growing stronger in spite of all of its challenges, and that is consolidating its institutions. We look forward then to a Romania that stands as the bulwark, the cornerstone of continued Euro-Atlantic values in the region during this time of transition. I can only conclude by going back to what I said earlier, that given my experience in the region in many different countries, including here, I have been very, very impressed with the talent of the people, the determination of the people, the capabilities of the people to look for solutions and to find them. I am entirely confident that this will be done together when it comes to Romania, together with the United States, together with the EU, together with the NATO, as we try to find solutions that make sense for us all. I'm very confident that Romania, even given this conference, that this conference will take its part in history as Romania's contribution to this overall dialogue. And once again, thank you very much for the invitation to be here. It's a great honor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for this global view on the new and old challenges in the Balkans, in Central and Eastern Europe, in the world. Our second speaker today will have the opportunity to counterbalance it with a local view, viewing the world from Romania. I give the floor to Ambassador Sergiu Ciolac.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had prepared a different, and made notes for a different presentation. But in the meantime, I received a copy of the Valdai Club report on the Balkans, on the Western Balkans, which is very recent. It was published end of September this year. And for your information, the Valdai Club is an international initiative, but it started and still is President Putin's private think tank. And some of the ideas or intentions are first aired through the scientific conferences of that group. Therefore, knowing that any paper or research product produced by and published by the Valdai Club has the authorization, if not the authority, of the highest political authority in the land. And that report is titled significantly, "Where are the Balkans heading? Question mark. A new cooperative paradigm for Russia." So it envisages a sort of recalibration of Russian policies in the region, having been faced, as the report half-heartedly recognizes, with a number of failures, not in terms of final assessment of the result, but rather compared to the initial expectations of the benefits Russia could have drawn from those actions. Let me just go quickly through the main themes of this report, because sometimes it is easier for us just to read interpretation in the Western press or in analytical papers, and we neglect going to the source, the original source, to see for ourselves what the Russian policymakers themselves think or are planning to do. First, on the uses of history. This idea goes like a thread throughout the report, saying that Russia has always been in the Balkans as a major player, if not as a dominant power, for more than 300 years, since the times of Peter the Great. And oft quoted is the fact that Peter the Great actually had established sort of diplomatic relations with the independent state of Montenegro at that time. This being said, the report makes it clear that in the Russian views of today, the Balkans have never been dominated by a single outside power for long. For some time, yes, but not on a permanent basis, even as an aspiration. They all also emphasize the fact that there is a subtle balance between outside interference and domestic agenda in the Balkans. That has been the case for a long time and is more acutely felt today. Coming back on, to more closely to our time, this historical interpretation draws a clear distinction between pre-2014 and after. Although they don't precisely mention the occupation and illegal annexation of Crimea and interference in southern Ukraine, or for that matter, the Syrian military adventure, they regard that year, 2014, as a sort of the watershed in Russia's relations with the West in general. And they see the Berlin process started immediately after the Crimea episode, the beginning of the Crimea episode. The policies of the West in general, vis-à-vis Russia, have taken a clear direction that is hostile to the Russian interests. Namely, that in their view, the West has decided to establish its strategic long-term dominance in the region of Southeast Europe. The second theme that transpires throughout the report is that Russia is presented as a staunch defender and champion of the sovereignty of individual nations, states in the Balkans. And they see Russia as the last hope for countering what they describe as Western colonialism, neo-colonialism in the Balkans. Surprisingly, in the same breath, they write that the increased activism of the West, United States on the military side, European Union using the two tools that they have, democratic transformation plus economic assistance, may cause a recrudescence of the looming danger of ethnic strife and conflict in the region. So they make this strange association between the two. There are two major elements that they stress in particular as counter to the Russian interests. One is the increasing military presence of NATO and other Western powers in the immediate vicinity of Russian borders. And the second is a nervous reaction to the various projects which affect Russian quasi-monopoly on suppliers of energy, in particular natural gas. And they enumerate the various pipeline projects and liquefied natural gas terminals as a direct threat to Russian economic interests, suffocating Russia by depriving it of the access to the legitimately acquired market. At the same time, the authors recognize that Russia is not in a position to compete with the European Union and other Western countries on the economic side, and that Russia should understand that for the time being it will remain in a sort of minority position in terms of economic and financial presence in the region. What is interesting is also the fact that while even some 10 years ago, Russia regarded NATO as and the United States in particular as its main adversary, but now the European Union is seen as on an equal footing with NATO as a danger to Russian security. Starting from those premises, the report advocates in the final chapter on conclusions and recommendations, moving, and that is, to my knowledge, something new, from the position of preference for individual bilateral arrangements with individual countries on a very selective basis, singling out, in particular, Republika Srpska in Bosnia-Herzegovina, as Ambassador Jakovic rightly mentioned. And then Serbia as the target of Russian special attention and interest. At the same time, since the report is very recent, it also mentions the fact that Montenegro is given for lost, which is an oblique recognition of the fact that they had something to do with the attempt to sabotage Montenegro's accession to NATO in the meantime. Instead of such an approach, this report suggests a rather vague idea of a multilateral regional approach, possibly together with other outside powers and partners, other than EU and NATO, such as Turkey, China, Arab countries, and, surprise, surprise, the United Kingdom after Brexit. And finally, they give a suggestion about how this shift of paradigm that they describe in the title of the report itself, that there is a future for the Balkans, in their view, to cultivate closer ties with the Eurasian Economic Union and also with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as an alternative to the siren calls of the West. They also mention the fact that the cultural sphere in education, arts, and so on can become a powerful instrument of soft power in the Balkans, based on the influence of Christian Orthodoxy in the Balkans, but also on the fact that most of the people in the region are Slavic. Some have Cyrillic script, and those are assets which Russia has to bear in mind in her long-term strategy. Finally, the report calls for a critical reassessment of the Balkan policies of Russia, and spells it clearly in two places in the report that it is impossible to imagine even that Russia would simply walk away from the Balkans. It has always been there, and it intends to stay in different forms. So we have the classical triad of any activities going beyond the realm of law or accepted international behavior. We have an intent, we have a motive, and we have an opportunity. So, time to be optimistic, but for every eventuality, it is advisable to fasten our seat belts before we are faced with a hard landing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to say that we have a half an hour, maybe even more, a little bit than a half an hour for a Q&A session. So the floor is open. Please ask our guests. Yes, please. Here. So that's
Thank you, Dan Petre, Romanian Diplomatic Institute. It's a common question for both ambassadors. What do you think about internal struggle into the Balkans? Because you both more or less addressed the external factors going into, I would say, the future history of the Balkans. But what shall we do with the Balkans themselves? Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's a very good observation that we were talking mainly about external factors and global factors. When it comes to looking only at the Balkans, I think I can say from my own experience that the two big factors, and I'm talking here about the Western Balkans only, not about any area including Romania. But in the Western Balkans, the basic dynamic is between the Serbian nation and the Albanian nation. And I use the word nation advisedly because there are different entities and different borders, but these are the two biggest nations in the region, and I think the dynamic between them, the tension between them, is the biggest. And the resolution of that will lead us into, I'm not sure what. It can be a very dark path, but it can be a path of resolution as well. And we heard this morning, I think, the hope for resolution, but we also heard a lot about that dark path as well. Now, what impresses me, and maybe it impressed you as well if you were here this morning, is that, and I find this unfortunate, but I'm going to speak very, very directly with you. It seems to me that in the Serbian mentality of today, we find a tendency to look back. We find a tendency to look to the history. A lot of this is understandable. The grievances were outlined and categorized by Foreign Minister Dacic this morning. So we all understand that. But when I look at the Serbian nationality and the government, especially today, which is very much a derivative of previous Serbian governments, I find that that look backward, that look to history, is not very positive. I juxtapose that with looking at Albania and the Albanian nation, and I find it remarkable. Here is a nation that was remarkably isolated. Much of it was self-isolation, but I'm not talking only about the Hoxha period, but even before then. They were the backwater, if you will, of Europe. But they were very isolated, had very little contact with the outside world. And where are the Albanians today? I recall traveling in the early days in Albania, early 1990s, and in Kosovo. In Kosovo, I had to speak Serbian in order to communicate with people. In Albania, I had to speak through an interpreter. Today, I go there, and the young people, and there's so many young people in this part of the world, they speak fluent English. I'm talking with someone who speaks fluent English with me. And I say, excuse me, where did you go to school? Oh, I've never been to the United States or to England. I would love to go someday. Well, where did you learn English? The University of Tirana or the University of Pristina. It is a forward-looking nation. According to the organizations that I belong to, there are more people opening businesses in Kosovo than in any other part of Europe, per capita. Per capita. This is remarkable. So in this dynamic between the two biggest and most important nationalities in the Western Balkans, I think it's going to be problematical because you have a Serbia looking backwards and an Albanian nation very much engaged in looking forward. The bright spot on this is the young people in Serbia. The young people in Serbia who do not necessarily buy into this historical view and who are very much want to be a part of the Euro-Atlantic contemporary trends that are going on. This I find to be the bright spot. But if I look at that dynamic, that is one dynamic. We can talk about many of them, including the stagnation in Bosnia-Herzegovina, the freezing of the wartime division in time of peace, which makes it very difficult for the government to do anything but regurgitate itself over and over again, even though we in the West say, can't you do something different? As we ignore the fact that what they have today is what we gave them, what the international community in the United States created for them and gave them and said, now you are free to act. Really? Anyway, that's a different dynamic, but we could talk about many of them. Please.
Thank you. I concur entirely with Ambassador Jakobic's assessment. So the only thing I would add is that let us not forget that not more than 20 years ago, in the former Yugoslavia, we had a bloody and very ugly war with tens of thousands of victims, acts of brutality unheard of since the Second World War. And probably it will take, hopefully, another full generation to be able to absorb and digest this very traumatic experience. Most of the population in this region have lived through the war and experienced the discomforts, to say the least, of conflict and the permanent specter of death and destruction, affecting themselves, their family, their property, their businesses, ruining their lives. And some, perhaps a larger number than we can guess, feel the trauma even today. So what the region and the people in the region actually need is friendly, sympathetic, gentle nudging towards the suggestion that the present and the future are also a reality, not only the past. That living in the past promises nothing good for their children and grandchildren. We have heard echoes of that today. I think that the only way to influence people in the right direction meaning the direction which is good for them, not agreeable to us, is crucial, and that has to continue.
Further questions, please? Don't be shy. Yes? Oh, yes, please.
Hello, my name is Mihai Vilcea. I'm coming from the youth center here from Timișoara. And I have one comment and one question. First of all, regarding the young generation. Last week we just ended an international project with people from Kosovo, Serbia, Macedonia, and also Western countries in the same place here in Timișoara. And I want to highlight that although the war was 20 years ago, the new generation that is coming is not blaming the same young people that they have the same age for what actually happened before. And this traveling and engagement, it's actually taking a good role in the going forward. And my question is coming in this way, because you're speaking about external factors regarding the Balkan areas, but also you spoke a bit about what's happening inside. My question is coming as follows. What should be Romanians' role in the area? And furthermore, what's supposed to be our role as Timișoara community? Because just bear in mind that we are closer to Belgrade and a lot of other capital in Western Balkans than we are close to Bucharest.
Yes.
Just to answer your question about what can Romania do in the region, I remember that in the early 90s, and especially on the background of the Yugoslavs' war of secession, there was a sort of a fashionable idea which was described as flight from the Balkans. The Balkans was a dirty word. We did not want to be associated. We preferred to be associated with Central Europe because in the Balkans there is always trouble and we don't want to be associated with that sort of trouble. I'm happy to say that in Romania at least, the Balkans for quite a number of years is no longer the definition of something troublesome. In fact, if you look at the map, you see that we are sort of halfway, like Turkey, for instance, which is part European, part Asian, and it has that natural reaction of being both. It is not schizophrenic, it is just accommodating something that is real. I think that Romania has to think it over and measure it with its own diplomatic, economic, financial, and other resources, including military. Become a more active player, team player in the two teams that we are members of, NATO and the European Union. Because all the premises are there. Looking at the map, you see that, as Ambassador Dankovic mentioned, you see two slightly bigger countries in a constellation of smaller ones. And it's Poland and Romania. It's a responsibility that we may not like, but we have to take. And that implies a better awareness of the problems we face and the quest for reasonable answer to the problems once those problems are articulated correctly. I remember that in '99 I wrote an excursion into the forbidden field of political anthropology, and it was a comparative study of the hang-ups and hangovers which are common in the Balkans, including Romania, and Southern Caucasus, the newly independent states there. And those were, and even an inventory of the common points is very interesting. The cult of extended family. When there is a wedding in the Balkans or the Caucasus, you don't have just the immediate family members. You have 40, 50 people who are part of the family, a clan. It's not a tribal, classical tribal thing, but it's clannish. And that's micro-solidarity at the societal level can be put to work for good or for bad purposes. It is important to emphasize the good. Secondly, it is an obsession with history. Events that happened 300 years ago or more have a relevance today in practical decision-making, not only in people's minds and dreams. Third is the refuge in culture. The cultural traditions and the cultivation of national culture is very important for them. Where else in Europe is the folk songs and dances are as active and alive today than in the Balkans, and, surprise, surprise, in the Caucasus as well. I think that in all that, the younger generation has a role to play, and we don't have to push them to play that role. They're already doing so. You noted the ambassador's observation about the dynamics of entrepreneurship in a country like Kosovo with no entrepreneurial tradition. There is not only hope, there is a new reality in the incipient stage.
Would you like to say? Yeah, yes, yes.
Well, I defer to Romanians to talk about what Romania can do, but I will say this very briefly. It's encouraging to hear what you said about the youth groups not having this grievance towards one another in the new generation, and that's certainly an optimistic view and one that conforms with my own optimistic view of the future. I would say this, though, about Romania. It can be a model for regional cooperation, because many of these states, if we look at them as state actors, had to go through a period after the dissolution of Yugoslavia, or they felt they had to go through a period where they distinguished themselves from everyone else. They were independent, and so Slovenia and Croatia, no, we are not part of the Balkans. We have nothing to do with it. We are Central Europeans. We want to join these organizations, those organizations. And other states, perhaps for different reasons, had a particularist attitude about themselves vis-a-vis the other states. No one would have proposed to these states that they form a new Yugoslav federation. They would not have been inclined to do so. But they went to the opposite direction, to the point where there was a lack of cooperation very often, and sometimes still is. Sometimes still is. So I think if Romania can provide a model for regional cooperation, this is something that the states of former Yugoslavia certainly need.
Thank you. Yeah, please.
I think I once again agree with the ambassador. I wonder if we will ever have the opportunity to have a good quarrel about something. I think that Romania really has a duty to serve regionally, not to lead, to serve. Because we have the experience of something very rare in Europe. The crucial decisions of the past almost 30 years in Romania were taken by a national consensus of all meaningful political forces, not just parties represented in parliament. And that was one, the first one, was to establish as a national goal the membership in NATO and the European Union. And the second was a more recent one, to fulfill ahead of schedule the NATO set target of 2% of GDP for national defense and security. So when the issue is really important, historically important for the nation is able to mobilize its forces. And in order to serve, not necessarily to lead, we have to put some order in our own house. Because there is a lot of empty, low-grade political bickering which paralyzes substantive action. We are, in Romania, probably also in the rest of the Balkans, very adept at letting small, trifling, trivial differences obstruct our more meaningful advance into what will be a better future.
Thank you. We have a further question in the middle there. Professor Dungaciu.
Dan Dungaciu, New Strategy Center, and I would like to go back to, well, more or less realities in the Western Balkans. And, you know, there is a new old joke in the Balkans, the difference between pessimists and optimists. In the Balkans, I mean, the optimists believe Turkey will join during the Albanian EU presidency, while pessimists believe Albania will join during Turkey presidency. So, having said, I mean, it's the mood. It's, well, it's sort of limbo as far as the, you know, the step forward is concerned. So, in this, recently, a sort of new proposal came up, and I would like to know the opinion of the two distinguished panelists on this. The border changes in the Balkans as a way to settle the old conflicts. Is it feasible? Is it realistic, redrawing of the Balkan borders in order to help us to move forward or not? Because there are two opinions on this issue, and maybe you can enlighten us a little bit. Thank you.
As far as border changes are concerned, I have addressed that very briefly in what I was saying. I'm fully understanding those who advocate what they would say is a one-time border change, if that's what it would be, between Serbia and Kosovo. Because they say this cannot be resolved any other way, apparently. They say that it need not establish a precedent for other issues in other areas. but I'm a little bit troubled about it on different dimensions. One is that sometimes looking for an easy solution doesn't give you the best solution. I'm troubled also because of what I said in my remarks, that there is a tradition among most states here, not all, but among most, of multi-ethnicity, multi-religiosity within the countries. And this has contributed, I think, to a spirit of tolerance, a spirit of pluralism, a spirit of mutual respect within the country and between that country and other countries. And it's a positive point of Balkan history rather than a negative point. It can be a negative point if you look at the 1990s and the outbreak of warfare in Bosnia. You say, well, what is he talking about? Because these people were fighting each other. Yes, of course they were. But there were hundreds of years before that of Bosnian history, of the nationalities living together in one form or another. So I'm troubled from that point of view. I don't think you can keep the genie in the bottle, as we say also, because I think once that principle would be applied, even by people who would say it's a one-time application, I'm afraid there would be others who would say there's an even easier issue waiting in the wings, and it happens to be, for example, Republika Srpska in Bosnia. I will say something a little bit perhaps controversial, but I say it directly to friends here in Romania. As I listen to the Serbian talks about Kosovo, and I myself I am of Yugoslav descent, as you may know from my name, I say to myself, I wonder what would happen if we somehow waved a magic wand and Kosovo were part of Serbia today. What kind of entity would this be? How would Belgrade govern this? How would the people of Kosovo be governed? How can we do that? If you look, however, at eastern Bosnia, which is nearly homogeneously Serbian, and which borders upon Serbia, how easy that would be. So how quickly would we go from an argument of we have made a border change between Serbia and Kosovo, which was a very, very difficult thing to do, really. And now we're going to look at, oh my goodness, we have an entity in eastern Bosnia that already has borders. We have an entity in Bosnia that already has a president that rejects the idea of living in a multicultural state of Bosnia-Herzegovina. How much easier would that be? And we only have to go from there to other places around the Balkans, and this becomes an opening of a can of worms. In my day, I don't know, I think you will have your own backgrounds on how these borders were formed, but when it came to Yugoslavia, when it came to even the Soviet Union, there were reasons why the borders were put in place. Sometimes the reasons were nefarious, but sometimes they were also studied very hard by the Yugoslav National Army and studied very hard by the Yugoslav government. Who lives where that border is going to be. There's a reason why that border is there. It is not drawn for some strange political reasons. It's drawn basically along ethnic lines. And for want of a better standard of measurement, I think we have to take those historical borders and respect them. I'm fearful of doing something different.
In recent history, there are also some example of successful border changes with exchanges of population. To think about the First and the Second Balkan Wars at the beginning of the last century. But in the meantime, something better has been invented, which thankfully in Europe we have, and that's the European Union. Transparent borders, not porous borders, but transparent borders. even the absence of the feeling that borders exist. You drive from one country to another without a passport, just to eat well at a restaurant, the famous restaurant in the nearby neighboring country. So I think that the ultimate answer exists. And that answer did not exist before the existence and the actual gradual maturing of the European Union over decades. The European Union is indeed a solution, a successful one. I hope that the renewed, the recrudescence of populist nationalism, even in some established democracies, as we have seen recently, will not destroy the good work that has been done so far, validated by the facts of life in the European Union. So the answer exists, provided the European Union exists.
Thank you very much. A final question, please. Yeah. Here, please.
Good evening. My name is Yasmina, and I'm studying international relationships and European studies. And my question is about Moldova. More exactly, in the Romanian press and in Moldova, of course, has been talking about Moldova wanting to reunite with Romania, and I've been questioning about how this could happen, or if it is actually possible, and what consequences there could be, especially securities ones. And I would actually want to know your opinion about it, and to know how this could affect not only Romania, but also the whole Europe, the European Union. Thank you.
I think it would be presumptuous of me to give you an answer on the subject on which we have the prime national authority on the Republic of Moldova and the prospects of future Romania's relationship with Moldova, the Republic of Moldova. So perhaps Professor Dungaciu would be so kind as to provide an educated and authoritative answer on that question.
No? A short answer, maybe? Okay. No? No. Okay.
Would you like me to?
Yes, please. Please.
He declined to.
He declined.
Considering that we wrote an extensive essay together with Professor Dungaciu on Romania's relations with Russia after 1989. In my capacity of co-author, although I didn't write that particular subchapter, I can repeat what more or less we wrote together in that essay. Undoubtedly, the native core population in the Republic of Moldova, the majority population, are Romanians by any description. Language, identical. Culture, history. It was one country for a long time. But if we jump to the question of possible reunification of two what are, after all, Romanian lands. We have to bear in mind that the ultimate decision is not Romania's, but of the people of the Republic of Moldova, of a clear majority of them. The decision is therefore for the Romanians in the Republic of Moldova to take. But it is the duty of the Romanian state and the Romanian people, also through democratic expression, to accept Moldova, if the Moldovans, if they want to do so. However, there is not a majority appetite in the Republic of Moldova to join Romania at this time. In addition, there is a crucial problem in the relations between, historical relations between Romania and Russia in connection with Moldova. More precisely, what Moldova is and what the Moldovan language is, which is contested by Moscow at the political and scholarly level. So it is not a matter for tomorrow. It may be a generational thing. It may never happen. But it is one of the two subjects in which we have a historical issue between ourselves and Moscow, which are not subject to an immediate solution. Time will have to decide. We professional diplomats understand probably best, even compared to the clergy of all religion, the value of time. In this sense, we have a more or less Chinese thinking. We think in centuries. It is something that we share in diplomacy. Sometimes it is better to wait. Sometimes it is a pity to lose an opportunity, a window of opportunity which may last only a few years. So it is for history to decide, and history doesn't go only backwards, it also looks to the future.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Ambassadors. It's been, I think, a very challenging and interesting discussion, and I'll announce the break. Please come back in 15 minutes. Bye.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It has been a long day. I congratulate the survivors, and including us, as Ambassador Niculescu is saying. In the interest of the community, I think we are going to start even with a brief delay for humanitarian reasons. However, I think this last part of our panel will be as inciting as the first ones. And I will allow myself briefly, before introducing my partners in this exercise, to return a little bit to the leitmotif of this meeting, which, as Ambassador Celac said, was time. I just to come back to some of the ideas presented and which will be presented, I will give you some quotations. I will start with the first one. There is no such thing as minor changes in the Balkans. Richard Holbrooke. Maybe some of you have heard about him. Another one is belonging to an American anthropologist who I think is of Serbian origin. If I am wrong, probably Ambassador Jakovic could correct me. Trajan Stojanovic. In one of his works, common with Romanian anthropologist, Vintila Mihailescu, some of you may have heard about him. This anthropologist and Balkanologist said that there have been no worthwhile changes in the Balkans since the Neolithic till the end of the 19th century. Nothing fundamental has changed in this part of Europe. Now, another one is Winston Churchill, who said that the Balkans generate more history than they can digest. And here we come a little bit into our discussions today, which were the, how to say, quintessential contradiction between history and non-history. Too much history, too much past, and not very certain future. Although after the panel on cybersecurity, my view on the future is much less bleak. There is hope from the 22nd century and the new generation. Why did I mention this? And I will go to another quotation from Albert Camus. Mal nommer les choses ajoute au malheur du monde, meaning that inappropriate definition of things does nothing but add to the misfortunes of the world. What is the relation to our subject today? It's the question of the definition of the Balkans. And I will allow myself to quote and then give you the floor. In 1808, a German geographer, during the Napoleonic War, therefore, August Zäune, made a new definition of the European peninsulas. Pyrenean, which is the Iberic, it did not stick. It did not stick. Alpine, which is the Italic, it did not stick. And Balkanic, it stuck. Now, what is about this definition of the Balkans? At that time, it was not clear where the Dinaric Alps were coming from and where the Balkan change was coming from. Actually, we have here our Turkish colleague. He will tell us where the word Balkans come from. In fact, this was a geopolitical definition of the European Turkey at that time, of the Ottoman Empire. And then you had a new definition after the Peace of Bucharest, after the Russo-Turkish Wars. And in 1911, just before the last Balkan Wars, in the Petite Larousse Illustrée, here what they were writing on. Turkey and the Balkan Peninsula, composed of Romania, Serbia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Montenegro, and then they added Turkey and Greece. Now, Ambassador Celac just told us that Romania does not happen to belong to the Balkans, and neither does Turkey. No. What's in a word? And then you have, again, a geopolitical terminology of Germany with Southeast Europe. We have discussed this morning. Why did I think necessary to mention these things relating to the appropriate naming of the definition of terms? It is evident that this is a convention, and this convention on the definition of the region has been the product of the geopolitical pressures, balances, relations, wars, and so on. Now, to avoid the trap of the past, which was very much discussed, and even of the present, I am privileged to, and to look into the future, I am privileged to introduce these distinguished panels. I will start with Ambassador Simona Miculescu, a long-time friend of mine. She has a distinguished and very rich diplomatic career, ambassador to the UN, spokesman to the minister, but I would like just to point out, spokesperson, sorry, again, spokesperson, madam, and I would like just a personal souvenir. Meeting in Kosovo in early 2000 when she was spokesperson to the head of mission of the OSCE. Kosovo at that time was quite a dramatic place to visit, and we were preparing the Romanian presidency of chairmanship in office of the OSCE. That was a historical mission, I would say. Now, we have here a great expert, not only on the Balkans, but also on the eastern and southern fringes of Turkey, Mr. Murat Aslan, who has several hats as scholar, researcher, and former military analyst, I think. And my younger friend from the New Strategy Center, I am also from the New Strategy Center, a retired diplomat, Horia Ciurtin, who will present to us the external actors to the European Union in the Balkans from an economic point of view, mainly focusing on China, which was mentioned earlier in the interventions. Now, begging you forgiveness for my opening remarks, I will give the floor to Ambassador Miculescu. Please.
Thank you. Thank you, dear George. Gheorghe, let's say Gheorghe. So young and already a Gheorghe. Well, I will start with contradicting you. I won't speak here about the past, maybe a little bit about the future, but I would intend to speak about the present in the Balkans. And let me follow the tradition, the recent tradition. I will start with a quote, but I will quote from my former boss, whom I served as spokesperson in 1993, Minister Teodor Meleșcanu, who said at the start of his speech this morning that these are extraordinary times for the Western Balkans. And it is so true. And I'm very grateful to the organizer, the Universitatea de Vest Timișoara and the New Strategy Center, for contributing so much to the awareness of the importance of this region, strategically speaking. And of course, I've been listening the entire day with huge interest to this stellar group of experts and officials and decision makers on a theme that actually is both old and contextual, both challenging and interesting, and one that carries at the same time positive signs but also worrisome trends. I know that it's the end of the day. I know that the intensity, intellectual intensity of the day drained a lot of your energy and minds, but we are still daring to catch the last bits of your interest. We actually could see and can see, and of course try to analyze the winds of change in the Western Balkans. On the one hand, posing new challenges to replace the old ones or to add to them, while on the other hand, carving a path, hopefully towards a synergistic approach to a joint future, and hopefully good neighborly relations supported by the wider neighbors and the global axis of power. Many of you, of course, and of them have covered the extensive gamut of challenges, both old and new, that confront the Balkan region. But of course, I will attempt to touch upon them from the UN perspective, because we spoke a lot about the EU perspective, the NATO perspective, but there is also my organization that has been playing a huge role in the region for so many years. And I'm very grateful that I was invited to add the voice of the UN to this. We are actually aware of the fact that these fairly new transitioning democracies with newly carved borders, not only on the map, but what is even more important, in the minds of the people, most certainly carry umpteen challenges. They are caught amidst the never-ending tug of war between the West, led by Washington and Brussels, and Russia to the east, in addition to the European and Euro-Atlantic perspective and integration efforts. The demands placed upon the EU aspirations of the countries in the region to meet the acquis focus heavily on, as we know, implementing the rule of law, transparency, as well as good governance, and a range of socio-economic, political, and administrative reforms, having in view the many negative factors, such as high levels of youth unemployment and rampant corruption and a disturbing state of media freedoms. Meanwhile, as we heard today, also some in the region voiced concerns over the perceived lack of clarity expressed at the EU Western Balkan Summit in Sofia in terms of the EU perspective, a tone that was slightly discordant to the earlier optimistic enlargement mantra. This may be attributed to the EU's own internal issues, including the impeding Brexit, the lack of consensus in decision-making, and all these aspects were mentioned. Furthermore, Brussels' recent focus on connectivity rather than enlargement may be perceived, and it is perceived by some of the political elite in the region, and also by the citizens in the region, as an alternative rather than a complement to the very successful Berlin process. So I would add, of course, the status of Kosovo and the ongoing divisive politics around it in the region and across the East-West fulcrum. That remains another unresolved issue where Brussels has tried to facilitate and support the dialogue and the normalization between Belgrade and Pristina. And you saw this morning that we are on a stale with this. Of course, I have to mention the increased talk of the so-called border reconfiguration, delineation, land swap, or whatchamacallit, that is emerging on both sides as a bit towards a final solution to end this, as they call it, frozen conflict. Then there is a hype around the rise of violent extremism and radicalization, thank you so much, in certain Muslim areas of the region, such as Bosnia and Herzegovina or Kosovo, which in itself may serve as a deterrent to international support. At a certain point, I was trying to think and dare you also to do an exercise of imagination. I would say a constructive exercise of imagination. And imagine, what if the increasing influence of Russia, China, Turkey, and the Gulf states in the region, instead of being considered only harming to the Euro-Atlantic strategy, could be seen as a constructive factor and result on the unique positioning within which the region finds itself? Well, maybe my colleagues, my fellow panelists will join me in this daring exercise. Further underlying issues include incomplete transitional justice processes, incomplete security sector reforms, constitutionally or otherwise embedded solutions that propel an illiberal politicization of ethnicities. If not properly and adequately addressed, this could simmer into a complete slowdown, if not a halt in the EU integration processes, but we don't want to even think of that, right? Yet, of course, we can all take solace in Montenegro's recent European and Euro-Atlantic progress, some positive gains in the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, I use the UN term, in its 25 years old naming dispute with Greece, and I would highlight the fact that this has been a process facilitated by the United Nations, or forays toward good neighborly relations influenced by the constructive, let's call it, relationship between Prime Minister Edi Rama of Albania and the Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić. Well, the role of the United Nations in this region is probably, or I think it is, much more discreet than its partners, EU, NATO, or OSCE. But trust me, we try to be effective and constructive, and our agencies, UNDP, UNICEF, UNHCR, UNESCO, and many others are really, really involved in a discreet way, but efficient way, I think, in reforms achievement, in peace building, in sustainable development, or capacity building endeavors in all these countries in the region. And as you know, the United Nations and its Secretary General Antonio Guterres place conflict prevention, which is key, a key word of his mandate, and sustaining peace at the core of our efforts to address peace and security challenges all around the world, and of course in this region. That's why synergies between the different international organizations who support the countries in the region is absolutely essential in my view. This synergy is perhaps among the most visible in Kosovo, where the UN's mission, UNMIK, the acronym that we are all familiar with, works side by side with NATO's peacekeeping force, with KFOR, and OSCE's institution building mission, OMIC, in supporting the implementation of the Security Council Resolution 1244. Joint efforts are also taken in the field of reconciliation and building intercommunal trust as some of the basic foundations for lasting peace. And I think that these key words, reconciliation and trust building, are one of the major but somewhat sometimes neglected areas where the international support can really make a difference, and we act in this respect. As an example, UNMIK organized recently a so-called trust building forum in Ljubljana, Slovenia, on a neutral territory, that brought together a wide range of actors from the political, civil society and academic arena in Kosovo, both Serbs and Albanians living in Kosovo who would never talk to each other back home, but who managed to talk to themselves, to each other in Ljubljana. And actually this was a bid to foster societal change and to foster working and living in integrative communities and building this intercommunity trust and confidence that I was telling you about. And you could see in that forum very clearly that achieving a societal reconciliation in the aftermath of conflict can be even harder because the relationship between groups has been so severely fractured, not to mention the destruction of institutions, of course. And moving from societal reconciliation to increasing trust, first and foremost, requires the acceptance of all individuals' rights to coexist. If tolerance, an almost forgotten word, and compromise cannot easily be achieved in the aftermath of conflict, they can be promoted within the process of trust building. And this is where the United Nations, with its rich institutional memory, plays and should always play a role in analyzing and identifying the root causes of conflict, recognizing triggers, outlining preventive and mitigating measures via the use of its preventive mechanisms and tools, including its good offices that we all know. It is ever clearer to us that the multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and multicultural Western Balkan societies need ever greater political, cultural, and economic investments in inclusivity and cohesion, so that people appreciate the benefits of diversity rather than perceiving it as a threat. Thus, our organization, the United Nations, together with the other partners, remain committed to this region, and we try to help its nations overcome their inhibitions, their frustrations, and challenges, so that it can become part of political and integrative processes that would ensure its long-term stability and prosperity. And let me also reinforce finally the imperative of the crucial role of the younger generation. It was highlighted many times today. It's lovely to see the young faces in this room. And I want to stress the fact that this is a top priority for the United Nations, because the younger generation is not only the future of this region, it is the present of this region. So, in this spirit, I shyly hope that next year, at the 3rd edition of this admirable and respectable conference, at least a representative of the younger generation will be on the stage, not only in the audience. That's actually also the case, enlarging the metaphor for the role of the younger generation in the region and in the world. Oh, they are still look at me. That's great. We managed to keep their attention. I'm very grateful for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Simona, for your lively intervention and the optimistic note of its end. And now it's my pleasure to give the floor to Professor Aslan and to see some other side of the moon of these Balkans we have been discussing for the whole day round.
Not the dark side of the moon.
I said some other side.
Pleasure. Yeah. First, let me answer the question you had directed to me, at the beginning of the presentation. What does the word Balkan mean? Well, if you divide the word in two pieces, that means bal and kan, it's true. It's honey and blood. But the original name comes not from these two, the unification of these two words, but it means mountainous regions with forests and deep creeks. That means it tells the nature of geography. That's it. So I think you are satisfied with the answer. Now let's come to the position of Turkey. For the last 3 to 4 years, I have read many articles claiming the stance of Turkey as challenging or a shift or sometimes, going away from Europe, the United States, or NATO alliance. And it's a common argument for the last, maybe 3 to 5 years. Do you agree? For me, no, I don't agree. But first, let me describe. Can we call the stance of Turkey for the last 3 years as the new one, a different one, or the same one which continues for the last, 5 to 6 decades? And the second one, the second question, in what direction this new stance, if exists, continues? And to answer these two questions, I think, first of all, we have to understand the psychology of the states. I mostly resemble states with the individuals. All individuals perceive the environment, first the factors, internal dynamics, that means social, cultural background, family training or education or experience. And also there are many different dynamics that this individual cannot control. And states are the same, which means states have internal dynamics, social, cultural, a training system or education system or military, and a deep history. And also expectations from the future. What I mean, not only the history, but also expectations shape the attitude of the states. And the second thing, if you go to the dynamics that you cannot control for states, then you have to either defend yourself or be prepared in case any occurrence threatens you. So, for Turkey's stance, first we need to understand in what position in terms of geography, social and cultural background, and also political preferences. And actually, if you understand Turkey's position, Balkan preference, Balkan stance is very easy to understand for Turks. And the second thing, for the last 3 years, Turks are now extremely feeling the survivability in real terms, which means we experienced harsh events for the last 3 years. That means we put forward the famous concepts of realism and begin to apply it. So let us discuss first what factors do shape Turkey's position in politics, international politics. The first one is for sure geography. Imagine that you are in the middle of 3 lands and 3 seas. 3 lands, Balkans, Caucasus, and the Middle East. And potentially, all crises may erupt in one day, and you have to be prepared all the time. And the second one, 3 seas, Black Sea, Aegean Sea, and Mediterranean. And for sure, many reasons, for instance, energy resources, for instance, illegal immigration, for instance, especially between Turks and Greeks, sovereignty, because 6-mile, 12-mile issues, for instance, are major determinants for the relations of Turkey and Greeks in the region. Hence, Turkey does not only recognize Balkans as one input for the politics, but only one input, other than 3 seas and 2 other lands. And consequences of any conflict in these areas directly affect Turkish position. Challenge. Think that if there's a problem in the Black Sea, we are directly involved. We do not have any other option. If there's a problem in Mediterranean, that means we have to be prepared in terms of military and politics. And if you go through the Middle East, for instance, doesn't matter if it's in Syria or Iraq or any other part, or Iran, that means Turkey needs to be prepared for the crisis because the consequences will directly affect us. That means in Balkans, the same. But if you do not be prepared for the Middle East, you cannot arrange the politics in the Balkans and think that your friend opposing your interest in the Middle East cannot be your friend in Balkans. And that means it may be a kind of bargaining in the coming period. What I believe is that this geography is a kind of gift for Turkish politicians to balance all regions and seas at the meantime if they are talented enough. The other one is historical and cultural heritage in the region. That means we have to put forward the communities. Imagine that Turkey is not full of Turks. We have many different ethnicities. We have many religions. We have many different cultures. For instance, we had made a kind of search, and we tried to identify how Cherkess population entered Anatolia. And we identified 3 ports at the north, and there are huge and thick lines that Cherkess are living currently. That means they are in between Turks, Kurds, Georgians. That means mixed. You cannot divert them. And we have to be very careful in designing politics then in Balkans, Caucasus, or the Middle East, because any wrong step will escalate tension in country. Another issue, foreign powers, major ones, Russia, China, the United States actually, think that in this geography, all major powers do want to have a hand. And they want to have the initiative to shape the region and to shape the consequences of every political or military event. If this hand is against your interest for Turkey, that means you must be prepared to counter it. Yes, currently, Turkey and Russia have a common ground in Syria, but it doesn't mean that they will have the same issue in Libya, for instance. But still, it's a major power, and we have to be prepared for incursions. And another dimension, Turkey is growing. A very, fast-growing country, I think 16th or 17th big economy in the world, and producing almost everything, including all defense industry products. Now, started, fighter jets program, which means now Turkey has become a regional power and also expanding the sphere of influence towards the neighboring regions. For the last 1 year, our defense products are heavily exported to, for instance, Gulf countries, mainly United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and also Saudi Arabia. And if you take all these dynamics, does Turkey give up the mind of or being a member of NATO or commitment to European Union? No. Turkey is still committed to be a member of European Union and also is conscious of her responsibilities to NATO. Turkey is not in search of any alternative, but Turkey has learned something from the events of the last 3 years. Let me refresh your minds, for instance. The first one is the PKK terrorism, which suffered, for the last 40 years. And we dedicated 40,000 lives, including military and civilian. Terror attacks, especially for the last 3 years, increased at the southern border, especially in the cities in the vicinity of the borderline with Syria. We had plots in 2014, political ones, from the Gülenist movement. We call it FETÖ. And also we had a coup attempt encouraged by this organization in 2016. Think that the members of these organizations are currently living either in Europe or in the United States. Now, Turkey has lessons learned then. Turkey wants to have a position that let me be myself, let me lean on my own power, and let me draw my own line in the region. And because of that, Turkey preferred 2 different strategies. The first one is diplomacy. Turkey consulted with the allied countries and also the ones who are a party of the problem, excluding Syria. And later then decided what to do in terms of politics. The second thing, after 2016, Turkey did not hesitate to start a military operation, especially in the Middle East, especially in Syria. That means Turkey preferred a proactive military stance if diplomacy could not solve this issue. But Turkey's perspective towards the allied countries is actually changing nowadays, especially in the eyes of public. The first one is the latest economic attack on August 11th of this year. As you know, there was a great loss of value in Turkish lira. We suddenly experienced dollars, for instance. It was 4.30 or 40, something like that, Turkish liras. Now it's more than 6 Turkish liras. It's almost 40% devaluation at one day. Think that at the meantime, President of the United States is delivering a tweet and says, this is a strong dollar and I increased the taxes of steel, something like that. Then public and Turkish politicians perceive such tweets as threat because the timing is very important. There was only 1 hour passed after the event, which means Turkey wants all allied countries stand firm alongside herself. But if you go through all the events in the Middle East or in economic field, that means Turkey has to prefer a self-sufficient position. Another issue is that Turkey approaches Balkans totally bilateral. Imagine that last year, Turkish president visited Serbia and attempted to establish warm relations. And afterwards, as you know, Serbian prime minister visited Turkey. And we had, contracted an importation of meat, like 5,000 tons of, beef. It was just a support to Serbian nation. It was actually a conscious attempt because Turkey is aware that in Balkans, if you once, demolish the bridge, like in Mostar, that means it's hard to build it up again. And because of that, currently, Turkey is in a position that Balkans altogether must enjoy stability and prosperity, but not dependent on the foreign powers, but by themselves. For instance, one question that one of my colleagues asked before coming here, why Balkans could not achieve a union of economy among themselves. It's a dream. But why? We are neighbor. We all have the same consumption habits. We can produce. Why? So I think we have to be in Balkans self-sufficient. So consequently, the answer of my latest question, the question if Turkey is enjoying a shift in terms of access and approaching Russia and China, well, we have common grounds currently in terms of economy and military engagements, but tomorrow we do not know what will, we will experience. That means we have to discuss it tomorrow. So that concludes my presentation. I wish you enjoyed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor, for the lights you have shed on the complex geopolitical environment of Turkey and the usefulness of this analysis also for our own approach to events in our part of Europe. And now, my friend Horia, I invite you to enlighten us on your far-reaching insight to Eurasia and China.
Thank
and
you.
the Balkans, naturally. Thank you.
Well, I have the pleasant but not so easy task to wrap up the discussion concerning new challenges in the Balkan area. So I will do so by taking into account a NATO and EU perspective, but embedded in the realities of the Balkans from within. I must confess, I initially prepared to also talk about Russia and Turkey in the Balkans, but I think Mr. Chelak and Mr. Aslan have informed us very consistently, and I don't have anything else to add. Therefore, I will address the once improbable rise of China in the region, showing how far and how deep its economic influence runs, and how this commercial footprint can be translated into a political vocabulary. Therefore, as a preliminary step in my analysis, I must say that the challenge of China concerns an unexpected great power on our doorstep. While too busy concentrating upon our EU-wide internal dynamics and too preoccupied by Russia and Turkey's game in the Balkans, we have long neglected the buildup of China in the region. In all respects, China's engagement with the Balkans has gradually and consistently expanded. But by now it has managed to surpass all the traditional players in terms of perceived impact and importance, leaving only the European Union to compete within this fragile spot of the continent. However, we have to wonder ourselves, what can explain China's consolidation in the Balkans? Neither historical nor religious affinities, neither spatial proximity nor adherence to a community of values. Is it a pragmatic partnership or a deeply managed geopolitical design? At the first glance, it would seem that China's presence is determined by mere economic drivers, tapping new markets and opening up alternative transit corridors along its Belt and Road initiative. Thus, it can be first said that upon reaching EU's periphery in the Balkans, China followed a very cautious approach, but ambitious nonetheless. It well understood the opportunities in the non-member states, but on their path to once joining the Union, and the decreased market pressure in newly fledged member states. But it also saw the risks in antagonizing the Union in its own neighborhood or in appearing as a disrupting factor. That is why Beijing advanced gradually, offering financing where EU-based institutions and banks were less inclined to, and being constantly careful not to seem a menace. Once these factors are taken into account, the European institutions and member states must take Beijing's Balkan gamble for what it really is. It is neither a philanthropic gesture nor a spoiler scheme for undermining the EU, but an efficient pursuit of self-interest devised to open up alternative corridors to China's largest export market. Such a quest focuses rather on developing and maintaining inroads through a region whose loyalty is much easier to obtain and cheaper. Therefore, when analyzing Beijing's economic footprint across the region, it can be argued that no Chinese business comes with completely no strings attached. Trade, investment, infrastructure have a political component, which cannot be separated from the entire process. Economic influence can be subtly translated into strategic pervasiveness, as Beijing is able to obtain from its partners an alignment of position or a self-restraint for manifesting against PRC's core interests and fundamental policies. In this sense, at the present moment, China is in every Balkan state's top 10 commercial partners. It is not an overwhelming presence, but it possesses a durable and growing share of the region's trading portfolio. However, in every single instance, its export and import position is dwarfed by the European Union, which it's more than 20 times bigger in every country. However, China is not in the Balkans just for trading. Its presence there is not mainly mandated by its sales of goods. It is there to establish a different kind of position. While commerce might be a necessary way in, it needs to be supplemented with other means of commitment, direct investment and infrastructural development. And China has been on a shopping spree for industrial assets and building up roads, bridges, rails that might one day ensure the flow of goods to the EU inner core. Thus, in this regard, one only needs to take into consideration how China agreed to fund and construct, or even upgrade, roads and rails from various coastal areas up into the European heartland. Thus, the Aegean, the Ionian, and the Adriatic seas are to be linked by highway or railway with the Serbian-Hungarian cluster, which is considered to be China's shorter path to the European Union. But what does this level of influence mean for the EU itself? Should China's approach be seen as an alarm signal, or rather as an opportunity to have a co-interested partner in developing much-needed infrastructure? What does it represent for NATO? A mild security threat, or a pathway to increase stability? Well, the Euro-Atlantic institutions are at present caught in a dilemma. They have a need for other prosperous actors willing to invest in the Balkans as responsible stakeholders for the region's future. But they also fear the risks of having an external global power with a different agenda in such a volatile environment within their vulnerable flank. Well, it must be said that money, infrastructure, and friendly summits that China brings here might not bring by themselves the advent of communities of values, such as NATO or the EU, but they surely make recipients of that capital more cautious in taking stances that might offend their creditors. And thus, Europe is at a crossroads. While China is laying the groundwork for an ambitious project on its periphery, knocking gently but very determined at the gates, the European Union has not yet formulated a clear response. Far from professing a coherent strategy, the EU has tactically micromanaged every faulty interaction with Beijing so far. It has made use of long-existing instruments in situations that are entirely new and cannot be circumscribed to the previous patterns, failing to find a systematic approach in dealing with China's presence. Seeing this, the European Union needs to properly calibrate its reaction in order to get the best of both worlds. That being a stable Balkan neighborhood set on the path to clear accession, and having a co-interested financier which invests in the regional infrastructure and industry, and thus relieving a little bit of the Union's burden from being the only noteworthy source of capital. Therefore, the main challenge for the EU is to obtain the desired governance results and channel the Chinese capital in such a way that it does not impede on the Union's Balkan policy, while also keeping Beijing interested in doing business in the area. Thus, neither exclusion nor unlimited access, but a balanced policy of cooperation in an area that needs all the capital and infrastructure that it may get. Because in all matters, China is a new neighbor, unlike any other, and it is here to stay. Thank you.
Much, Horia. It was a rewarding way to conclude this marathon. Now, it seems that we are in time, relatively in time. I think we have time for about 15-20 minutes of questions and answers. And then it will be my privilege to invite Ambassador Chelak to wrap up everything and bring us the conclusions. So now the floor is open for questions, and you are invited to raise your hands and challenge the speakers. Were they so unquestionable clear that there are no, it means that they were perfect. Yes, they were perfect. Now, please, gentlemen, you have the floor. And
Thank
please,
you.
please introduce yourself.
My name is Flavius Silioni. I've been working with refugees and asylum seekers in Romania for 6 years now. So I'm working in the migration field. But my question is not related to this. It's a question for Professor Aslan. I might not have enough understanding of all the political background and situation. But as far as I understand, and I've been looking a little bit, is that there are critics who are claiming that Turkey allegedly support for NATO is swifting more to Russia, which in the context of Balkans that we would want them closer to European Union and NATO could be a challenge. How would you comment on that?
Let me explain it in, a couple different perspectives. One critics comes to Turkey, since Turkey now currently procuring S-400 air defense system. This is one issue. And as you know, the United States is totally against such kind of attempt, and the US Senate issued a decree to, question the F-35 project, which Turkey is a partner, not buyer, but partner of the project. If you take S-400s as a case, Turkey is totally dependent on the air defense system of NATO, which means we do not have system. We only had Oerlikons, maybe our soldier friends know it, and also we had Stingers. And for the high altitude air defense, we had F-16s. But imagine that you are neighboring the Middle East. In the Middle East, you are neighboring Iran. There are many countries in the region producing rockets, and you don't have system. And we decided to buy, air defense system, especially for the higher altitudes. And we applied our European friends, and now we are in a project, Eurosam. We will produce together with Italy and France. Also, for the urgent needs, we applied to the United States. They offered, as I remember, $4.5 billion and no technology transfer, and there were limitations for the usage. That means if you want to use it, you must have approval. So Turkey, diverted the direction to China. Negotiated, decided to buy, later then changed the mind. And now we are currently buying S-400s. So if you go through the NATO countries, especially the ones that have a history with the Soviets, they have a huge arsenal of Russian weapon systems. But currently, Turkey is opposed to buy a system from Russia. And we had, knocked the doors before procuring it. This is one reason, for such an allegation. The second thing, Turkey is actually questioning the spirit of alliance nowadays. One reason was, for sure, economy, and the other reason, especially July 15th coup attempt. It was I experienced it, in Turkey. It was a totally disaster for Turkish history. Think that I'm a former soldier. There are soldiers who are not loyal to Turkish constitution, but a religious community, and they are somehow encouraged to start a kind of coup in Turkey. This is unacceptable. And think that this organization is currently operating schools in exactly 142 countries and educating new generations for what? And Turkey expected support right after coup attempt from the Western Hemisphere. Imagine that the initial message came from Russia, unfortunately, and China, which means Turkey was looking for a support, a psychological one, not a physical one, from the world, and it's first Russians who says we condemn such an effort. So, prejudice suddenly occurred in the minds of people and politicians. And politics afterwards suddenly changed the direction. The first one was Syria, because 40 or 35, I don't remember the number of days, but approximately 40 days later, Turkey started operations in Syria, military operations. Because at the meantime, think that in Syria, your ally is cooperating with the extension of PKK by changing its name. It's a direct threat to Turkey. That means now Turkey has to do something to cut a corridor that will surround the neighborhood borders. Otherwise, we will face another state in the future that will, create a safe haven harboring this organization and managed, supervised by this organization. And you have to shake the hands of Russians at that time, because they have the authority to check the aerospace and also have the control of Assad regime. Otherwise, you have to face with Russians. So, cooperating with Russians in Syria is actually started right after July 15th coup attempt. Not before that. And please forgive me, but I have experienced in terms of military, we faced many incursions during the operations, not only from the Assad regime and also Russia, but also the other side, east of the Euphrates, for instance, electronic warfare. Our aircrafts faced all incursions from all parties, which forces Turkey be self-sufficient, stand alone, and decide by herself. This is not a change of paradigm, but just a preference to be an independent actor as far as her power is adequate. If you don't have power, that means it's the end of the road, Thank you.
Please.
Valentin Bercă, mă numesc, sunt din Craiova. I want to relate it to Horia presentation of China investment in Balkans. Please take in consideration that China is building infrastructure transport, but also China sold defense equipment to Serbia, several drones. So European Union and NATO could take in consideration this business of China in Western Balkans. Another statement, in 1905, Ottoman Empire recognized Vlach as nation and as church, and came at Revenue à nos moutons. I want to ask Ms. Miculescu regarding possibility that several 100,000 of Romanian from Balkans, as Megleno-Romanians, Are-Romanians, Istro-Romanians, Vlach, could improve position of Romanian within all country of Balkans area. Thank you.
Well, yes, you're right about the drones. Well, actually, I know that China globally, and in Europe at least, it tries to keep a very low profile in arms sales. When it provides, it usually provides dual-use instruments. And as far as I know, the Serbian drones have been mainly for surveillance purposes, not armed for offensive purposes drones. But it's true, in the medium term future, we could see the usage of assets that China is building and upgrading and using in the Balkans, and here I mean the ports, for dual-use purposes. We've seen it happening over the world in other parts, and it is a concern that needs to be addressed by NATO and the European Union when they are taking over entire ports infrastructure. I agree.
Thank you for the question. I think that you remember me more as a Romanian diplomat, because this is actually a question for my colleagues, and actually we have a colleague from the Romanian embassy in Serbia. As a UN representative representing 193 countries, all I can tell you is that the Romanians around Romania are an asset. Of course, it depends very much on how the Romanian government deals with their issues, how they mobilize them in sharing the common heritage and valuing it. So my answer is a big yes.
One more question? I give you the time to be tempted. Then I start reverse counting. And now I think we have to invite and first thank the speakers. I was grateful to have you in the panel I moderated, and now I am happy to invite Ambassador Celac to give us the light of the light of the dawn from the twilight, which has come upon us. Thank you.
First, I would beg you all not to expect from me a final word of wisdom. So there was a capital of wisdom throughout our conversation for the whole day. And also the very rewarding conversations we had privately with each other during the coffee breaks and other opportunities. So I'm not as presumptuous as to try to draw any conclusions. Just a few thoughts in the margin of this fruitful, informative, and even educational debate. First, I think that it is clear for most of us that the Balkans are once again in the limelight of global geopolitics. Whether we like it or not, it is there, and the moment is crucial. The speed of change throughout the world in economy, finance, technology has brought up a number of challenges which we share with the world, but here in the Balkans, specific local headaches are also present. When the Commission President Juncker talked about the rising specter of war in the Balkans, I interpret that statement of his, which was reported on the 5th of September by Euronews, as a word of caution rather than the imminent threat of an outbreak. And this is always good to keep in mind, because there is a lot of combustible matter in the region, in this region in particular. But I would also refer to Minister Sergei Lavrov's statement before the United Nations General Assembly this year, which mentioned the Balkans specifically as a sort of a renewed tinderbox as a result, he said, of NATO's encroachment. So the Juncker statement was not so badly misplaced after all. I would also note that the awareness about the existence of the Balkans and the challenges arising from the specific security and development situation in the Balkans has risen. It has been reflected in very specific terms, in a concrete manner, by the Bulgarian and then Austrian presidency of the Council. And we were encouraged by the statements made by the Romanian officials that the Romanian government is going to follow in the footsteps of the two predecessors at the presidency to continue emphasizing the importance of the Balkans, not as much as a danger, but rather as an asset for European security and stability as a whole. Ambassador Jakovic, I hope I quote you correctly, sir, mentioned the prospect of starting thinking about a post-Dayton condition in the Balkans. Dayton has served us well for 2 decades. First and foremost, it stopped with a price, with some risks, but it stopped the irresponsible barbarian bloodshed that happened during the ugly war in the Western Balkans. But I think it is already happening. Subjects that have been considered taboo in relation to the application of the Dayton Accords are being actively discussed. Even actions that theoretically are breaching the letter but not the spirit of Dayton are being discussed. So there is a new dynamic, political dynamic in the Balkans itself, and also in the attitude of so-called outside actors. And there are risks in that, but also there are opportunities. We at the New Strategy Center have for at least a couple of years held the view that the Balkans, the Black Sea, and the Levant are becoming part of a single security space. The problems may be different, but they are linked. And when you think in strategic terms about regional stability, you see reverberations of one region into the other region, exactly as Mr. Atlan has told us. Finally, I think that since in my more advanced age, I follow a number of conferences and debates, either in closed committee or in of a more public nature. I was impressed by the mutual courtesy, I would even say elegance, of this debate. There have been no asperities, no hostile polemics, and the quest for answers to problems that preoccupy us all has been sincere and real. The scholarly quality of the discussion was also remarkable. There were moments, and not just one or two, when I had a feeling of envy towards the speakers who were just delivering their presentations. And you can fake almost any human sentiment. You can fake even love or hate or indifference. That can be faked, but envy is always sincere. So the Timișoara event is now an established annual event. The quality has improved from the first to the second, and the third will be even better. So we shall be happy, honored, and immensely pleased if you join us all the next year for the third edition of the Timișoara Summit. Thank you.